The United States' decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki has been called one of the most decisive actions of World War II, but also one of the most controversial. Was it a necessary evil to end the war, or a disproportionate act of violence that forever altered history? In this video, we explore why some view the U.S. as a villain in its conflict with Japan during World War II. Introduction. World War II was a conflict of unprecedented scale, marked by fierce battles, strategic alliances, and catastrophic loss of life. The war in the Pacific was particularly brutal, with the United States and Japan locked in a deadly struggle for dominance. While the U.S. played a critical role in defeating the Axis powers, its actions against Japan, especially the use of atomic bombs, have sparked decades of debate and criticism. Today, we'll unpack the events leading up to this controversial decision, the devastating consequences, and why it casts a shadow over the U.S.'s role in the war. Part 1. The road to conflict. To understand why the U.S. is seen as a villain by some, we need to go back to the early stages of its conflict with Japan. In the 1930s, Japan was expanding aggressively across Asia, occupying territories like Manchuria and launching a full-scale invasion of China. The U.S., aiming to curb Japan's ambitions, imposed economic sanctions, including a critical embargo on oil and other vital resources. These sanctions crippled Japan's ability to sustain its military campaigns and heightened tensions between the two nations. Japan saw this as a direct threat to its survival as an empire, which culminated in the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The surprise military strike aimed to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but it also triggered the United States' entry into World War II. In retaliation, the U.S. launched a relentless campaign against Japan, employing strategies that pushed the island nation to the brink of collapse. But it's the methods and their consequences that have left some questioning the morality of the U.S.'s actions. Part 2. The firebombing campaign. Before the atomic bombings, the U.S. demonstrated its capacity for mass destruction through a brutal firebombing campaign. Major cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya were targeted with incendiary bombs, causing widespread devastation. The Tokyo firebombing of March 1945 stands out as one of the deadliest air raids in history. In a single night, approximately 100,000 people were killed, and much of the city was reduced to ashes. Families perished in the infernos, and survivors were left with harrowing scars, both physical and emotional. While the U.S. justified these bombings as necessary to undermine Japan's war effort, the sheer scale of civilian casualties and destruction has led many to label these acts as terror tactics rather than military strategies. This phase of the war showcased the grim reality of modern warfare and set the stage for the even more controversial atomic bombings. Part 3. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6, 1945, the world witnessed a new level of devastation as the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The blast obliterated the city, killing an estimated 70,000 people instantly. In the days and weeks that followed, tens of thousands more died from radiation exposure and injuries. Just 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing an additional 40,000 people on impact. The aftermath was catastrophic. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out, survivors faced lifelong health issues, and the psychological trauma echoed across generations. The U.S. claimed these bombings were necessary to force Japan's surrender and avoid a prolonged ground invasion that could cost millions of lives. However, critics argue that Japan was already on the brink of defeat and that alternative measures, such as a demonstration of the bomb's power or continued diplomatic pressure, were not adequately pursued. For many, the use of atomic weapons was less about necessity and more about showcasing power, particularly to the Soviet Union, as the world shifted toward the Cold War. Part 4. The question of necessity. Was the atomic bomb truly essential to ending the war? Declassified military documents and testimonies suggest that Japan was already in a dire state, with its economy in ruins and military infrastructure collapsing. Some high-ranking officials within the U.S. military even believed the bombings were not required to secure victory. This has fueled debates about the true motives behind the decision. Was it purely about ending the war, Or was it also a calculated move to assert dominance on the global stage? The atomic bombing sent a powerful message to the world, particularly to rival nations, about the destructive potential of the United States. This perspective complicates the narrative, painting the U.S. not only as a liberator, but also as a nation willing to go to extreme lengths to achieve its objectives. Part 5. The Legacy of Villainy. Decades later, the events of World War II continue to evoke mixed emotions, particularly in Japan. Hiroshima and Nagasaki have become symbols of peace, resilience, and the devastating consequences of nuclear warfare. Survivors, known as Hakusha, have shared their stories to advocate for nuclear disarmament and ensure that such horrors are never repeated. Globally, the atomic bombings have sparked endless debates about the ethics of war, the limits of power, and the responsibility of nations to uphold moral principles. While the U.S. remains a close ally to Japan today, the scars of the past serve as a reminder of the complexities and contradictions in historical narratives. The question remains, was the U.S. a hero for ending the war, or a villain for the methods it chose? Perhaps the answer depends on which lens you choose to view history through. What's certain is that the legacy of these events challenges us to consider the human cost of war and the lessons we must carry forward. Conclusion. The story of the U.S. and Japan in World War II is one of conflict, power, and profound tragedy. As we reflect on this history, it's crucial to recognize the immense suffering caused by the choices made. The actions taken by the U.S. against Japan, particularly the atomic bombings, remain among the most controversial in history. This chapter of the war reminds us that in the pursuit of victory, the means can shape the legacy as much as the ends. Let's strive to learn from the past, not to assign blame, but to seek understanding and work toward a more peaceful future.